Xander had always known that attending the Galactic Academy would be a challenge. The institution was famed for producing the brightest diplomats, strategists, and leaders across the known universe. It was a place where species from thousands of different civilizations came together to learn the intricacies of interstellar law, politics, and warfare. But nothing had prepared him for this. The rule memorization directive. The moment the professor activated the holographic display, the entire lecture hall darkened. Rows of alien students, each from vastly different biological backgrounds, turned their attention to the screen as it flickered to life. A vast digital tome materialized, filled with 10,000 individual laws, regulations, and procedural codes. Xander's jaw tightened. This, the professor began, her voice carrying the authority of centuries, is the foundation upon which all civilized galactic interactions are built. You are required to commit these rules to memory. Failure to do so will result in immediate expulsion from the academy. A murmur spread through the class. Some species, like the Urvath, a reptilian race with eidetic memory, nodded in quiet acceptance. The Crexians, a hive mind species, hummed in unison, already linking their collective consciousness to begin the memorization process. Others, however, displayed clear signs of unease. Xander felt his stomach knot as he skimmed the data in front of him. The laws were absurdly detailed, covering everything from interstellar trade agreements to proper diplomatic gestures when greeting an amphibious dignitary from the planet Drivlock 6. Some regulations contradicted others, demanding a deep understanding of context and historical precedent. Memorizing all of this was not just difficult, it was impossible. He glanced at Krelok, his three-armed roommate who had grown up in a species known for their multi-threaded cognition. Even Krelok looked concerned, his upper set of eyes blinking rapidly as he scanned the enormous volume of text. "This is madness," Xander muttered under his breath. Krelok turned his attention toward him, his voice carrying a low, rumbling accent that was common among Zevrans. "It is extensive," he admitted, "but you humans are known for your adaptability. Perhaps you will find a way." Xander wasn't so sure. He looked around and saw students already beginning to work. Some pulled out advanced neural implants, linking their minds directly to the data, hoping to absorb it faster. Others closed their eyes, entering deep meditative states to encode the information into their long-term memory. Xander, however, knew himself well enough to recognize a hard truth. He wasn't going to memorize this. His memory was decent, sure, but he wasn't a bio-enhanced genius. Even the smartest human alive would struggle with this, the professor continued. "In exactly 2 weeks, you will be tested. The format of the exam will be randomized, and any mistakes will result in harsh penalties. No external assistance, no digital interfaces, just your minds." Xander rubbed his forehead, feeling the first stirrings of a headache. No external assistance? That meant no direct database queries, no smart wearables, and no AI-driven search algorithms. Everything had to come from memory alone. As soon as the lecture ended, students flooded out of the hall, already forming study groups. Xander, however, lingered. He watched the professor deactivate the holodisplay before stepping down from the central podium. Her long, serpentine body coiled slightly as she spoke with a group of high-ranking students, her narrow, golden eyes scanning the room with sharp precision. Krelok nudged him. "Are you staying behind to ask a question?" "No," Xander muttered, "just thinking." He turned toward the exit, walking through the grand corridors of the academy. Towering structures of polished obsidian and glowing energy conduits lined the pathways, their surfaces reflecting the diverse students hurrying to their dormitories. He needed a solution. He needed a way to circumvent the system without technically breaking any rules. By the time he reached his shared dormitory, Krelok had already pulled out his own study material, beginning the arduous task of memorization. Xander sat at his desk, his fingers drumming against the surface, deep in thought. Then, an idea struck him. What if he didn't have to memorize at all? His eyes flicked to the old laptop he had brought from Earth. The Academy had insisted that all off-world students abide by their strict no digital aid policies during examinations, but that didn't mean he couldn't use technology before the test to prepare. He pulled the device toward him, quickly booting it up. If he couldn't memorize the rules, maybe he could make a system that did it for him. His hands moved instinctively, fingers dancing across the keyboard. A rule processing program, something that could take all 10,000 laws, categorize them, and predict which rules would be needed in any given situation. Xander grinned to himself. He wasn't going to play by their rules. He was going to rewrite them. Xander's fingers moved swiftly over the keyboard, his mind working faster than it had in weeks. He wasn't memorizing, wasn't reciting rules in his head like the other students. Instead, he was building something. A system that could process every single one of the 1,0,0,0,0 rules in seconds. The idea had struck him like a lightning bolt the moment he realized that memorization was a losing battle. The Galactic Academy wanted to test his ability to recall information, but nowhere had it been stated that understanding the rules required cramming them into his brain manually. The core structure of the program took shape quickly. He designed it to scan and categorize regulations based on context, flagging those that were most likely to be relevant in different situations. His initial algorithm was simple. It broke each rule into its core elements: subject, restriction, exception, and enforcement. But as he worked, he realized he could push the program even further. By the time Krylock stirred from his meditation-like focus on memorization, Xander had compiled thousands of lines of code, refining the AI's ability to predict which rules would be needed based on real-time inputs. The key wasn't just storing the information. It was creating a system that could think faster than any student at the Academy. Krylock glanced at him, one of his three eyes narrowing. "You haven't read a single rule yet." Xander smirked, not looking up. "Not the way you have, no." Krylock tilted his head, his species version of skepticism. "And yet you look confident." Xander leaned back in his chair, stretching his arms. "Because I don't need to memorize them." He tapped the screen. "This does it for me." Krylock stood, crossing the small space between their desks. His upper eye focused on the glowing lines of code while his lower two scanned the raw data being processed. He frowned. "You wrote a program to cheat?" Xander scoffed. "It's not cheating. Nowhere does it say we have to memorize. It just says we have to know the rules. I'm just using a different method." Krylock's throat hummed. A deep vibration that Xander had learned meant cautious approval. "And what happens during the exam?" Xander's smirk faltered. That was the problem. The professor had been clear: no external assistance. His program would be useless if he couldn't access it during the test. He turned back to his laptop, eyes narrowing. "I just need a way to internalize the system." Krylock exhaled through his secondary breathing vents. "You mean to memorize the system that memorizes the rules?" Xander shook his head. "Not memorize, integrate." For hours he worked, fine-tuning the AI's response patterns. The problem wasn't just retrieving information, it was making it second nature. He needed a system that functioned so seamlessly that by the time the test came, he wouldn't be thinking about the rules, he'd be reacting to them instinctively. The breakthrough came at 3:42 Galactic time. Krylock had long since given up watching, resuming his own study process, when Xander let out a low laugh. His eyes burned from staring at the screen, but he didn't care. He had solved it. The AI was already brilliant at pattern recognition. But what if it wasn't just reading the rules? What if it was teaching them? He quickly rewrote the interface, integrating a dynamic response system. Instead of simply spitting out answers when queried, the AI would now function like an interactive tutor, feeding him information in a way that simulated real conversations. By the next morning, Xander was no longer actively studying the rules. He was living them. By midday, students were gathered in the Academy's main atrium, heads buried in hollow tablets or engaged in whispered discussions about memorization techniques. Anxiety crackled in the air like static electricity. Xander, however, leaned casually against a support pillar, his eyes closed as he listened through a discreet earpiece. Rule 6734, the AI's voice murmured. Illegal transport of weaponized plasma through neutral space. Xander responded instinctively, speaking in a low tone. Exception, diplomatic escort under emergency circumstances. Correct, the AI confirmed. A few students nearby glanced at him. He ignored them. He wasn't memorizing anymore. He was training. The AI fired rules at him in rapid succession, forcing him to react instantly. It adapted to his mistakes, shifting its approach whenever he hesitated. He no longer had to consciously recall. His responses became automatic, as natural as breathing. The biggest test came later that night. Krelok, who had watched Xander's progress with growing curiosity, decided to challenge him. "I will name a scenario," Krelok said. "You must apply the correct rule." Xander grinned. "Bring it on." Krelok's upper eye narrowed in thought before he spoke. An unregistered vessel enters restricted space outside the Varnath system. The pilot refuses to respond to hailing frequencies. Xander didn't pause. Rule 2285, unauthorized entry into high sexual zones requires immediate intervention from a neutral authority. However, subsection C states that, in cases of non-hostile intent, the vessel may be detained for a standard cycle before formal charges. Krelok folded his arms, but there was something close to admiration in his expression. Xander's grin widened. "I know." By the time the first mock exam was scheduled, whispers had spread across the academy. The human isn't memorizing. He's still getting perfect scores. How? The students were beginning to notice. Professors were beginning to suspect. And Xander? He was just getting started. The Galactic Academy's exam hall was unlike anything Xander had ever seen. The massive chamber stretched for what seemed like miles, its walls lined with shifting holo-displays that flickered between historical records, diplomatic rulings, and various planetary legal codes. The ceiling pulsed with soft blue lighting, casting an eerie glow over the rows of students preparing for the most grueling test of their academic careers. Xander took his seat, feeling the weight of the moment settle over him. Across the room, Krelok adjusted his posture, his three eyes scanning the exam instructions with practiced precision. Around them, students of every imaginable species were settling in, some whispering last-minute revisions to themselves, others sinking into meditative states, activating whatever mental enhancements their biology allowed. A low rhythmic chime echoed through the hall, signaling the arrival of the exam's overseer. The massive doors at the front of the room slid open with a hiss, and Professor Vexaris entered. Her long, serpentine form slithered effortlessly across the floor, her golden eyes scanning the gathered students with an unreadable expression. The room fell silent. "You have been given 2 weeks to prepare for this exam," she announced, her voice smooth but firm. "As you are aware, the purpose of this test is not merely to assess your ability to recall information, but to determine whether you can apply the laws of the galaxy in real-world situations. Those who fail will not receive a second chance." A few students exchanged nervous glances. The academy had never been lenient about failure. The professor gestured, and dozens of floating drones emerged from the ceiling, each carrying a small metallic examination cube. One by one, the cubes settled in front of the students. Xander studied the one in front of him, noting the intricate etchings across its surface. The moment it landed, a soft hum resonated through the air, and a holographic interface projected upward. Professor Vexaris continued. "The exam consists of 50 real-time scenarios, each requiring an immediate and correct response. Your answers will be judged not only on accuracy, but on speed. This will simulate high-pressure diplomatic situations where hesitation can lead to disaster. The faster and more precise your responses, the higher your score." Xander felt a surge of anticipation. This was exactly what he had trained for. Began. Instantly, the cube in front of him projected his first scenario. A trade vessel from the Eltharian Empire enters a restricted sector near a Terran colony. The captain insists it was an unintentional drift caused by gravitational anomalies. How do you respond? Xander barely needed a second. His training had conditioned him to react, not think. Rule 3821. Unauthorized commercial vessels must be detained pending an investigation unless gravitational interference can be confirmed by independent navigational logs. Subsection B allows for immediate expulsion if intent to violate territory is not established. He tapped the correct answer on the interface, submitting his response in under 3 seconds. The cube shifted immediately. A planetary governor imposes emergency martial law following a suspected terrorist attack, restricting all alien movement within the capital. The Galactic Charter guarantees freedom of movement under normal circumstances. Is this a violation? Xander answered in 2 seconds. No. Rule 7756 states that planetary governments retain the right to suspend Galactic Charter protections if a credible security threat exists. However, subsection D requires independent oversight within 48 hours. The cube continued, throwing increasingly complex dilemmas at him: border disputes, asylum requests, interspecies conflicts, trade violations. His mind barely registered them before his responses flowed out automatically. The other students were struggling. He could hear the occasional groans of frustration, see the hesitation in their faces as they wrestled with obscure regulations buried deep in the galactic legal code. Some species, known for their prodigious memories, were faring better than others, but even they couldn't match the speed of Xander's responses. Across the hall, Kraylock stole a glance in his direction, his upper eye narrowing slightly. He knew something was off. Xander ignored it and kept going. The test continued for over an hour. 50 questions, 50 flawless answers. When the final scenario faded from his holo-dimension, a soft chime rang out, signaling the end of the exam. Professor Vexaris remained silent as she studied the data in front of her. The exam hall filled with the quiet hum of nervous anticipation as students waited for their results. Then the professor spoke. Your performance today has been recorded and analyzed. Final scores will be available within the hour. She turned, her piercing gaze landing directly on Xander. Some of you performed, unexpectedly, well. Xander held her stare, keeping his expression neutral. She knew. Or at least she suspected. As the professor left the room, Kraylock approached him, his voice low. Your reaction time was unnatural. Xander grinned, but there was something guarded in his eyes. Maybe I just studied harder than everyone else. Kraylock didn't look convinced. And Xander knew. The real challenge was just beginning. Xander leaned against the metal railing of the Academy's central observation deck, watching the distant stars flicker beyond the massive energy dome that protected the station. The test was over, but the tension in his muscles hadn't faded. He could still feel Professor Vexaris's gaze lingering in the back of his mind, the unspoken challenge behind her measured words. The results hadn't been posted yet, but he already knew where he stood. Perfect score, maximum efficiency. But the problem wasn't his performance, it was how obvious it had been. Footsteps approached from behind. He didn't need to turn to know who it was. Kraylock stopped a few feet away, folding his arms across his chest. You're in trouble, Xander smirked, not looking away from the stars. For what? Doing well? Kraylock exhaled sharply through his secondary vents. For doing too well. I watched you. Others did too. You didn't hesitate once. Not even on the obscure rulings that tripped up the Yervath and the Varnaxians. The professor noticed. Xander finally turned, resting one elbow on the railing. So what? There's no rule against being fast. Kraylock narrowed his upper eye. No, but there are rules about external assistance. Xander's smirk faltered. He had known the risk, had even anticipated some scrutiny, but he hadn't expected Kraylock to be this direct. He had to be careful. He sighed and ran a hand through his hair. You think I cheated? Kraylock didn't answer immediately. His lower eyes studied Xander, scanning for any sign of deception. I think you found a loophole, Xander shrugged. That's what laws are, aren't they? Loopholes and technicalities. The Academy wants us to understand the system. I just Optimize my approach. Krelok's throat hummed again, this time a lower, more thoughtful vibration. That argument might work on some students, but not on Vexaris. Xander frowned. You think she'll come after me? Krelok nodded. She doesn't tolerate anomalies. She'll investigate. If she finds proof that you used an AI to train, she might not call it cheating, but she will see it as defying the intent of the test. And in this academy, intent matters as much as action. Xander cursed under his breath. He had been careful. He had designed his system to be a training tool, not an external crutch. But the distinction might not matter to someone like Vexaris. A loud chime echoed through the station, and both of them turned toward the hollow displays embedded in the observation deck's walls. Exam results were live. Xander's name was at the top. Perfect score. No mistakes. Murmurs filled the corridors as students checked the rankings. Some looked impressed, others suspicious. A few whispered among themselves, glancing in his direction. He had expected attention. But this was different. This was dangerous. That night, Xander barely slept. His mind kept replaying Krelok's words, turning them over, searching for angles he hadn't considered. He had done nothing wrong, but in an institution like the Galactic Academy, being technically correct wasn't always enough. By morning, his unease turned into certainty. The summons arrived via encrypted message. Cadet Xander, report to the High Council chamber at 900 hours. Non-compliance will result in disciplinary action. Mr. Vexaris, Xander exhaled slowly, forcing himself to stay calm. This wasn't an expulsion notice, not yet, but it meant Vexaris was making her move. When he arrived at the towering chamber, the doors slid open with a hiss, revealing a circular room filled with high-ranking faculty members. At the center stood Professor Vexaris, her golden eyes locked onto him with quiet intensity. Xander stepped inside, the doors sealing behind him. He didn't need to be told to stand at attention. He had been in enough disciplinary meetings in his life to know the drill. Vexaris didn't waste time. You completed the exam with unprecedented speed and accuracy. Explain. Xander met her gaze, keeping his expression neutral. I studied. I prepared. Vexaris's tail coiled slightly, a subtle motion that suggested dissatisfaction. All students studied, yet none came close to your level of performance. Your results were not just excellent, they were inhuman. That concerns me. Xander resisted the urge to roll his eyes. With respect, Professor, humans have a history of problem-solving in unconventional ways. I trained for the exam the way an engineer trains for a crisis, through simulation and repetition. Isn't that what the Academy wants? Adaptive thinking? Vexaris studied him for a long moment. You claim that your results are due to training, not memorization. Yes. She tilted her head slightly. How did you train? Xander's jaw tightened. This was the moment. He could admit to the AI system, technically not against the rules, but definitely not in the spirit of the exam, or he could deflect. He chose the latter. I built a framework, he said carefully, a way to internalize the rules instead of just memorizing them. I treated them like muscle memory. Vexaris's tongue flicked briefly, a sign of consideration. And this framework was purely mental? Xander forced himself to nod. Yes, it wasn't a lie. Not exactly. The AI had trained him, but he hadn't used it during the test. Vexaris watched him for several more seconds before turning toward the assembled faculty. We have no direct evidence of misconduct, and even if we did, there is no regulation that explicitly forbids this method of preparation. Xander held his breath. Then she turned back to him. But make no mistake, she said, her voice quiet but sharp, you have exposed a flaw in our evaluation system, one that will be corrected. Xander felt his stomach twist. She wasn't expelling him. She was adapting. Your next test, she continued, will not allow for frameworks. If you truly understand the laws of the galaxy, you will prove it in a setting where instinct alone determines success. Let us see if your mind is as sharp when it is forced to act in the moment." Xander clenched his fists. She was setting a trap, and he had no choice but to walk straight into it. Xander sat in the dimly lit training chamber, his heartbeat steady despite the tension coiling through his muscles. The upcoming test wasn't just another evaluation. It was a direct challenge from Professor Vexaris, a calculated attempt to strip away his advantage and prove that he had gamed the system rather than mastered it. The overhead lights flickered to full brightness, casting a sterile glow over the chamber's curved walls. Across the room, a group of faculty members observed from an elevated platform, their eyes locked onto the singular figure at the center of the chamber, Vexaris herself. She held no datapad, no holographic tablet filled with questions. This test would be different. Xander remained motionless as she slithered forward, stopping a few feet from him. "Your previous performance demonstrated exceptional recall, but now you must prove something far more difficult." He already knew what was coming, but he let her continue. "No preparation, no time to think. You will be given live scenarios in a controlled simulation where hesitation or misjudgment will result in immediate failure." Her golden eyes narrowed slightly. "You claim to understand the laws of the galaxy. Now, you will act upon them in real time." The chamber's walls shimmered as the simulation began. The sterile environment shifted, morphing into a chaotic space station. Sirens blared. A crowd of panicked aliens rushed in multiple directions. Security drones hovered above, their scanners flickering red as they attempted to control the disorder. Xander barely had a second to take it all in before a voice echoed from the speakers. Scenario 1. Unauthorized cargo discovered aboard a diplomatic vessel. The crew refuses inspection, citing interstellar immunity. Do you order a search, risking an intergalactic dispute? Xander's instincts fired immediately. Rule 4927. Diplomatic immunity does not cover non-personal cargo unless explicitly classified as classified goods under Treaty Accord 7B. "I allow the ship to dock under watch," he said aloud. "Diplomatic personnel remain protected, but cargo is restricted from transfer until an independent review is conducted." The environment shifted, a new situation replaced the last. Scenario 2. A planetary governor declares martial law following a mass riot. Off-world visitors are detained without explanation. Do you intervene? Xander responded immediately, "Yes. Rule 7756 requires planetary governments to provide a security briefing to interstellar authorities within 2 hours of detaining foreign nationals. Failure to comply invalidates temporary martial law authority," Vexaris observed, silent but keen-eyed. The simulation adapted, accelerating in complexity. A refugee crisis erupted in front of him. A soldier unlawfully opened fire in a neutral zone. A corporate entity bypassed taxation laws using planetary loopholes. Each time, Xander reacted without hesitation. His mind didn't pause to sift through information. The answers were simply there, embedded in his instincts. The AI training had done its job. Minutes stretched into an hour. The final scenario emerged. A high-stakes hostage situation on a deep space mining station. The hostage takers were from a species that operated under entirely different legal customs. The simulation expected him to hesitate. He didn't. The mining station is under the jurisdiction of its founding authority. Under Rule 6214, local law prevails unless intergalactic laws are violated. The hostages remain protected under Rule 1129, which prevents political leverage through civilian detention. I negotiate their release while allowing independent arbitration to handle territorial disputes. The environment froze. The sirens fell silent. The panicked civilians flickered out of existence. Then, the chamber walls returned to their neutral state. Xander exhaled. Professor Vexaris remained motionless, studying him with an expression unreadable, even by the standards of her species. She turned toward the observing faculty. Final ruling? A deep silence followed. Then, one of the older instructors spoke, his voice carrying weight. No errors, no rule violations. Another faculty member added, his reaction time exceeded previous cadet benchmarks. His decisions reflect true understanding rather than rote memorization. Xander knew what was coming next before Vexaris even spoke. This test was designed to expose a weakness, she admitted. Instead, it revealed an evolution. She turned back to him, her golden eyes locking onto his. Your method is unorthodox, but effective. You have demonstrated a superior way of internalizing the legal frameworks of interstellar governance. The Academy cannot dismiss this. For the first time, her voice softened, not in warmth, but in respect. Your approach will be analyzed, refined, and integrated into future cadet training. Xander took a slow breath, letting the weight of her words settle. He had not only passed, he had changed the system itself. The faculty murmured amongst themselves, some reluctant but ultimately agreeing. The Academy had been forced to adapt. Professor Vexaris stepped forward, lowering her voice so only he could hear. You rewrote the rules, Cadet Xander, just as I suspected you would. He smirked. I prefer to think of it as optimizing the process. A rare flicker of amusement crossed her face before she straightened. You will not need to take another test. Your records will reflect your accomplishment. Xander turned toward the exit, feeling the gazes of students and faculty alike on him, some admiring, some resentful, but none indifferent. As he walked away, Krillok fell into step beside him. So, you didn't just pass. No, Xander said, exhaling deeply. I changed the way the Academy teaches law. Krillok gave a deep, thoughtful hum. And now? Xander grinned. Now I find a new system to break. And with that, he stepped forward, not just a student, but a trailblazer who had reshaped the very foundation of the Galactic Academy.